What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and today we have a very exciting video. Why am I so excited, you ask? Well, because in the latest Destiny 2 update 6.3.0, Bungie finally gave us the buff that I've been waiting for. Glaives came into the game back in February with the launch of Witch Queen, and ever since then, I've been waiting for them to work with melee-based exotics. Why? Because glaive melees hit harder than regular melees, and I love melee-based builds. Assassin's Cowl Hunter has proven to be extremely strong in the hardest of content, and I've been crutching that build for years now. The power creep is certainly real these days, and I just found another pretty broken build. I will detail everything in the build in a minute, but first we are going to start with the basics. This build has a lot of buff stacking, so I'm going to take you through those step by step. So first, let's take a look at the changes Bungie made in the latest patch this past Tuesday with the launch of Season of the Seraph. The big one being glaive melee attacks can now benefit from the exotic armor perks on Synthoceps, Wormgod's Caress, and Winter's Guile. Unfortunately, due to this, the latter two exotics were nerfed. They used to give a 7.5 damage multiplier, but now only give a 3.5 damage multiplier, but in my testing, it's actually 3.75. It's still strong as you will see, but they would have been absolutely busted with glaives. And Synthoceps, they give a flat 3x damage multiplier when surrounded by 3 or more enemies. Additionally, Bungie nerfed glaive melee damage multipliers by 25 to 30% against champions, mini-bosses, bosses, and vehicles. Majors and minors are unchanged. Even with this nerf to boss damage, you will see it is still incredibly strong. And finally, glaive melee base damage was reduced from 75 to 67. So that's a lot of data, but let's look at how it translates in-game. Before we get to all the damage stacking, I want to go over a few things that do not work with glaive melees. Glaive melees are really weird because they work with some melee things but not others. You can get Swashbuckler times 5 with a glaive melee kill, but it does not buff the melee damage, but rather buffs the projectile damage. There is also an elemental well mod called Well of Ions, where picking up an arc elemental well causes your next melee to deal increased damage. Unfortunately, this does not work with glaive melees. As you can see in the background gameplay, when I get a regular kill, I hit for 8,675 damage. I then pick up the arc well and get melee damage bonus for 10 seconds, and then hit for 11,277, and then the buff goes away. It only lasts for one hit. But when I do the same thing with the glaive melee, I hit for 16,144 damage both times, and the damage timer never goes away. So it does not work. Kinda strange, but trust me, it works with something even better that we will get to. And lastly, the only other thing it doesn't really work with is things like minor, major, and boss spec. The projectile damage does, but the melee damage does not. So as mentioned before, Wormgod's Caress gives a bigger buff than Synthoceps, so let's walk through the buff. At base we hit for 16,144 damage, then with Burning Fist times 1 we do 23,006, times 2 we hit 29,867, times 3 42,782, times 4 51,661, and times 5 we hit for 60,540 damage.
That's a lot of damage!
But trust me, we're just getting started. So this season, we got a new solar glaive called Judgment of Kelgaroth, and it rolls with a new perk called Close to Melee. I made a video breaking down exactly how it works, but what we need to know for this video is that it improves your melee damage by 30% just by getting a projectile kill. And we can extend the perk's duration just by dealing damage. So if we factor in this perk with times 5 Burning Fists, that is 3.75 times 1.3, which is 4.875x damage. And here is what that looks like on Carl. On the red bar we hit for 78,702 damage, but on Carl we are hitting 55,092 damage because of the aforementioned nerf of the 25 to 30% on bosses, champions, and those things. Regardless, that still chunks the hell out of them, as you can see. But honestly, we're just getting started. Next, I decided to get Wormgods times 5 and apply a 30% debuff from Tractor Cannon on Carl. Now we are hitting for 71,619. Pretty crazy damage for a glaive. But we aren't done. If you are doing solo play, you can slap on Solo Operative from the seasonal artifact, and this will boost all damage by 15%. So that 71,619 damage would then be 82,362. Pretty crazy damage, right? But what if I told you I could go even higher? So earlier I mentioned that glaive melees aren't really classified as a weapon or a melee. They're kind of a hybrid. So the glaive melee does not stack with things like high energy fire, but the projectile does. But I found something that does buff the glaive melee. That is Radiant from the Solar subclass. Radiant states your weapons are enhanced by the power of the Traveler. So it is a weapon buff, but it does work with the Glaive melee. Sadly, I'm worried this will get patched, just because of how I think Bungie wants only certain things to interact with Glaive melees, but for now, this works. I was honestly really surprised to find out that it does work, but I love that it does. Bungie, please don't nerf this. Radiant is a 25% damage buff, and when we factor in every single buff, here's what that damage looks like.
Oh, that's a lot of damage!
That's right, we hit for 91,971 damage per melee. The base melee damage is 16,144, so this is a 5.7x multiplier, which I think is amazing. And keep in mind, it would be even more damage if melee damage multipliers on high health targets wasn't nerfed. So I can see why Bungie added the slight nerf, but even still, this is crazy strong. I love damage stacking in Destiny and doing crazy things, so I hope this doesn't get nerfed, because you do have to build into it very specifically, and glaives are in-your-face weapons, so there is high risk, high reward here. So let us recap the buffs and debuffs going on. We have a 3.75 times multiplier from 5 stacks of Burning Fists on Wormgod's Caress. Keep in mind this buff only lasts 4 seconds as well, so you have to be quick and set your DPS phase up fast. Next, we have 30% extra glaive melee damage from the new perk Close to Melee, so you have to get a kill before your damage phase starts. Then, you have 25% more damage from Radiant, which you can proc from a melee hit with the fragment Ember of Torches. Then, if you are solo, you can get an extra 15% damage from Solo Operative. This all adds up to a 7x damage multiplier. We then add in our Tractor Cannon, which debuffs the boss by 30%. So this is a 9.1x damage multiplier, but we do have the damage stacking nerf. So the final number you see is, like I said before, about 5.7x damage. I arrived at that number by taking the damage to Carl with all the buffs at 91,971 and dividing it by our base melee damage of 16,144. The math doesn't quite add up because with all those buffs going on, it should be 9.1x, and if we times that by 0.7, which seems to be the nerf, we would get 6.37x, not 5.7x. So I'm not sure why it doesn't add up exactly, but it doesn't really matter. I showed here how hard it can hit, and that is the point I'm trying to show off. This build is capital S strong. How strong, you ask? Well, I will definitely show you. I knew the perfect boss to test this on to see how viable it is in endgame content. As I mentioned before, Wormgods take a bunch of setup, so instead, I opted to use something with a little less burst DPS and a lot more sustained DPS. And that is my favorite exotics, Synthoceps. These increase your melee damage by 3x instead of 3.75x, however, they are way easier to proc as you just need to be surrounded by combatants. So these require far less setup and they're way easier to use for a sustained duration. So using the same buffs I went over with Wormgods, here is how it hits. With just biotic enhancements and close to melee procced, which is very easy to do, we hit 44,073 per melee on Carl. And then with all the buffs including Radiant, close to melee, solo operative, biotic enhancements, and the Tractor Cannon debuff, we hit 82,362 damage per melee. This kills him in only 4 hits. Wormgod was able to do it in 3 hits at 91,971 per melee, but as mentioned, that takes way more setup. So each melee hits for 9,339 less damage than a full stack of Wormgods. So Wormgod certainly has a bit higher burst DPS, but way less sustained DPS because you would have to run and get a kill to keep the buff up. With Synthoceps, you can just keep going to town on the boss, only having to stop to reapply Tractor Cannon and reproc Radiant. I'll show the whole build I used for Galron at the end and walk you through everything, but first, just check out the damage it does. The Throwing Hammer with 3 stacks of Roaring Flames does a whole lot more damage per hit, but the Glaive melee can throw melees far faster, so it seems to be higher DPS. So speaking of DPS, if we take our optimal DPS on Galron without the Nightmare buff, we hit for 61,313 per melee. And if we look at how fast we can get off our Glaive hits, we can get 5 3-hit combos done in 7.5 seconds. At 61,313 damage per hit, that is 183,939 damage per Glaive melee combo. This is a good amount of time before stopping to have to reproc Tractor Cannon and Radiant again. So that is 919,695 damage in 7.5 seconds, for an optimal DPS of 122,626. That is an absurdly high DPS for any weapon or damage combo, especially considering you don't have to expend any ammo other than one shot to proc close to melee. So the total damage output on this is nearly infinite. However, and this is a big however, it is tough to get optimal DPS with this build. Galron moves around a lot and hits you back, and you have to worry about staying alive when the enemies are damaging you. And you have to make sure that you keep all your buffs up. But really, the biggest factor is there are a lot of damage phases where there are not enough enemies around to proc biotic enhancements, or the boss is at a distance so beating them up is not an option, or they are too deadly to face up with, like the Wyvern in the new dungeon. So is this combination powerful? Yes, extremely. Is it practical? Not often. It is amazing for Galron, and the new seasonal activity Heist Battleground has great ad density, and this would work amazing in there for the Scorn boss, but less so for the Shrieker boss. I know I'll definitely be running it this coming week when I'm on my Titan. One final thing I wanted to go over were a couple more things about glaive interactions, and then I will leave you with the build for Galron. So Offensive Bulwark, the Void aspect, buffs your melee damage, but unfortunately, it does not buff glaive melee damage. I tested it, and you can see the testing in the background gameplay. However, the fragments do work. Echo of Leeching starts health regeneration on melee final blows. It does work on a glaive melee kill. Additionally, Echo of Exchange gives grenade energy for melee final blows. This does also work. Again, in the background footage, you can see me get my grenade energy back in about 13 seconds just by getting a bunch of glaive melee kills. But as I said at the top of the video, things like impact induction and hands-on and stuff do not seem to work, nor does the buff from Well of Ions or Offensive Bulwark. Anyways, I just thought I would throw that in there for information's sake. And that's pretty much going to do it for the video. I hope this gave you some good insight into how all the new glaive buffs work as of the latest patch update. Winter's Guile should work the same as Wormgod's Caress, but I did not test the numbers due to the API being down and switching weapons being a huge pain in the ass. If this video was informative and helped you out in some way, then a like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. I will now leave you with a quick build breakdown of what I used to solo 2-phase Galron, and as always, thanks for watching and take care. So here's the build that I used to 2-phase Galron with. We're obviously on Sunbreaker Titan. I like Burning Maul. This super actually does a ton of damage with Syntheseps, and since it's such a close range boss, this is a really good option. You want healing grenades for staying alive during the boss because you have to keep ads up so that you can proc biotic enhancements on Syntheseps. And then to extend the duration of your restoration so that you're always healing, you can run Ember of Empyrean. Solar weapon or ability final blows extend the duration of restoration and radiant. So you get radiant. When you're low health, you then throw down your healing grenade, and then you can just get a glaive kill. It has to be a projectile kill, not the melee. And anyways, that's fine because you proc close to melee when doing that. So you kind of have to get a solar kill anyways. So that's how you stay alive during the boss fight. And then the other important ones are Ember of Solace, which increase radiant and restoration duration. And then Ember of Torches, powered melee attacks against combatants make you and nearby allies radiant. So that's how we're constantly staying radiant, which is at 25% buff to the glaive damage. And then of course we have Syntheseps. I run double impact induction to get grenade energy back with melee damage, and then also melee Wellmaker to make elemental wells. I've got Seeking Wells on to get them easier, and then Well of Life to get health restoration as I'm running. Solar Operative, as we talked about in the build before, that's a 15% damage buff to everything. Double Hands On, just because you're getting so many hammer melee kills. This allows you to get your super quicker. Another thing to note is that hands-on and impact induction do not seem to work with the glaive melees. So that is one unfortunate thing about the build. And then of course we have Tractor Cannon for the 30% debuff on the boss, 100 resilience for the extra damage resistance, and then 100 discipline just because I like discipline and it'll give you healing nades more, even though you don't overly need it because we're running Sol Invictus. So every time we get a throwing hammer kill, we're proccing that sunspot, and that's giving us some restoration for a little bit every time we run through it. And then Roaring Flames ×3 to stack up the damage for our throwing hammer. So that is pretty much the build, and yeah, like I said, this new glaive goes absolutely insane. I'm not sure what the enhanced version gives. The API is still down as of the making of this video. But yeah, if it were to buff the damage even more, that'd be crazy. I'm not sure what it'll do, but I'll probably craft one. I also don't know what you can get in the second slot, but something to help reload, like Grave Robber or something like that, would be absolutely amazing on this. But again, I can't really look up what all the perks are because the API is down. But yeah, so that is the build if you want to go absolutely ham with a glaive.